Allie, welcome to the Storytelling Lab.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
So, I first heard about you, and to be honest, I'll be very transparent and candid. Kind of was bummed at myself that I hadn't run across your content yet because I love the stuff that you talk about. I love your approach, and we know a lot of the same people. So, I think it was JJ
Yeah,
Peterson um, who was promoting, made an
yeah.
Instagram post about your book, and he and I shared the stage, a storytelling stage years ago. I love him so much. Love Donald Miller and his work, and I know you all
Mhm.
are close. And when I saw it, I was like, "Who? What? Where? How did I
How
miss?"
have we not found each other yet? Yeah,
Exactly. So
I
I'm
know
really
that's
excited
great.
to talk to you. By the way, I know the professional name is Allison Fallon, but Ally Fallon just
Yeah.
rolls off. It's so good. It's so good. I love it. I don't even really know where to start. For me, I'm always interested in you've been very prolific
Mhm.
in the books that you've put out. I think it's going to help a lot of the people listening today because I wrote my first book self-published in 2021. I'm one of those that had the voice in my head for so long,
Yeah.
came up with reasons all the time, kept thinking of cool ideas, yada yada yada. So I always like to kind of go back to like where did this come from? Were you a writer at a young age? Were you artistic? And when did that, leap of the hump happen?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think everybody has this story, but I'm one of the weird ones who always knew I wanted to be a writer. I can remember being like 10 years old and thinking, when I grow up, I'm going to write books and they're going to be on the New York Times list. I was an avid reader from a young age. I was a storyteller. I was very introverted and
Mhm.
wrote in journals. And I had a fourth grade teacher who was really lovely and very encouraging to me and my writing abilities. And that just kind of put this idea in my head that I was going to be a writer someday. And then when I was in high school and college, I got a lot of feedback from grown-ups in my life who were saying, "It's so nice that you want to write for a living,
Uh-oh.
but you're going to need a backup plan because you can't make money as a writer." And because I was desperate to please, I my backup plan was to become a teacher. And I thought, if I'm a high school teacher and I work 9 months out of the year, then I have 3 months out of the year totally dedicated to my writing. And I'll get out of work every day at 3:30, and it'll be such a chill job that I'll get to just, I'll really be a writer, but I'll be a teacher that'll pay my bills.
Hmm.
And I think it's a really terrible reason to become a teacher, a terrible reason to do anything, but particularly with teaching, you just really need someone who's committed to the massive task of teaching and not who's doing it as a backup gig. So that fell apart for me very quickly. I mean, I was a full-time teacher only for a year. I
Hmm.
was a substitute teacher. I came out with my master's in teaching in 2008 when the economy was terrible. And so I subbed for a while, got my first full-time gig, and it was my first full-time year teaching that I was just like, this is not for me. And I knew that I wanted to write a book. So I thought, okay, if I can just get enough money saved to cover my living expenses for 6 months, then I can write a manuscript. That was somehow the 6 month number got in my head. So I quit my job and had enough money saved to live for 6 months. And 3.5 years later, published my first book. So that was a wild ride. And it was at that moment that I realized, oh, I have experience publishing a book, which a lot of people want to do.
Hmm.
I have a background in teaching and curriculum development. So I
Hmm.
can, I sort of know how to take a concept and break it down into simpler pieces. I could turn this into a coaching business and help people to put books together. And that
Yeah.
was where my business was born.
Who, if anyone, helped shape that perspective? Did you land on that on your own, or was there someone out there that you emulated in terms of like, hey, I have knowledge, I know how to teach, I just did a thing that people want to do?
Yeah,
Because often we overlook that, like you can teach that,
yeah.
but there are a lot of people who lead the charge in that. Was there somebody that inspired you to make that shift?
The only thing I can think of is just necessity is the mother of invention. My first book came out and it actually did very well in the marketplace, which was my sole focus was get this book out and sell a bunch of copies.
Which one was that?
Packing Light was the first one that came out in 2013. It's still to this day my best-selling book, which blows my mind. I don't know that I understand that, but it did very well. And yet, as despite it doing better than even the publisher expected it to do, I thought that would mean money in my pocket.
Mm.
And what I didn't realize is you really need to be selling hundreds of thousands of copies of a book in order to make a living wage. And so few authors ever get to that threshold. It's a difficult threshold to get to unless you're pouring tons of marketing money into the book, or unless you have a built-in platform for distribution, or there are other ways that books take off.
Yeah.
Um, but what I realized is, and this is what I teach authors now, is that the book didn't need to pay my bills. I could create an ecosystem where I had a business that was paying my bills, and that would free me up to do my creative work of writing a book, which actually I think is a better setup anyway. Like when you look at the people who have written pieces of work that we still read today, hundreds of years later, these people were not making a living off of their art. They were keeping their art for their art, and they were making a living working at a pizza shop or working at the post office or whatever it is. So I think we have this idea in the modern world that if I'm not making money from my art, I'm not a quote real artist. And I want to just like slash that and say, what if you, like, if you're good with numbers, go be an accountant and make your money being an accountant and cover your living expenses so that you free yourself up to be creative because you take care of your basic necessities in
Mhm.
this easy, simple way. And then you free up all of this creative energy to go do the thing that you want to do. And you don't put the pressure on your art to have to feed you.
Where did we start? I mean, this concept that you just said of the real artist, where did we come up with that idea that that equates to I earn all my income from art, like
Yeah.
exclusively? Where,
I
you
don't
know,
know. That's a
is this
great
so
question.
crippling and so it's such a barrier for folks because they
Hmm.
do think that it's like
Yeah.
I'm an aspiring writer, right? I'm an
Yeah.
aspiring screenwriter. So let me just ask you this directly: what makes a real artist or a real writer? This
Yeah.
concept applies to film as well. I've got some things I
Yep.
want to share with you, but yeah, what makes a real writer in your
Well,
opinion?
I'm going to steal a phrase from Anne Lamott, and the phrase is just butt and seat. That's the only thing that makes a real writer. And people have a long list of things that they believe, because people will tell me a lot of times. I work with like everything from total beginners to New York Times bestselling authors, and I hear the same phrases over and over again. And one of them is, I'm not a real writer. So I will ask people, well, what would make you a real writer? And the list varies from person to person. But some people have on the list, well, a degree from, some specific university would make me a real writer. If I was on the New York Times list, that would make me a real writer. If I was trained as a writer in some kind of a writing program, that would make me a writer. If I was better at grammar, that would make me a real writer. And I don't think any of that stuff makes anyone a
Agreed.
real writer. In fact, I think it's like such a distraction. What makes you a real writer is butt and seat. Just get your
Just
butt in the seat and get the writing done.
yeah.
Just that's it.
This is before we started, I talked about that I don't really super structure my conversations. I love to just let them go where they go, and I've done this long enough that I can be confident with that. This is exactly why. Like, I love that we landed here so much because just yesterday I live in North Carolina, and there's a nonprofit called the Southern Documentary Fund, and it
Hmm.
sponsors as a fiscal sponsor for Southern documentary so that you can get your donations can be tax exempt for folks.
Okay.
And yeah, so great local program here in Durham, North Carolina. They sponsor one of my films, and they just had a really cool Instagram post yesterday, and it was just sticky notes of all the filmmakers that they sponsor of the things that they do to earn extra money so that
Yeah.
they can make their films. And it was like funny and like and but so accurate and true, and I think eye-opening for a lot of folks because if you're in the silo or in your own head, you think like, I'm not a real writer, I'm out there having to Uber. But when you
Hmm.
saw all of your contemporaries sharing, like, yeah, I Airbnb, in my house,
Yep.
I Uber, I do this, I teach, I make crappy commercials for crappy corporations, like all of these things,
Yeah.
and I'm so happy that we landed here because I've been here, you've been there, you just told us the story,
Yep.
and all the people that we hope to help inspire are there all the time, and I think that the best word that you said, in my opinion, was the ecosystem. Can we
Hmm.
can we stay on that for a second and elaborate on like how can you does it have to be I go get a job that's irrelevant and make money and then do my art, or can we create something that where it feeds the art that we want to do, like
Yes.
you've done? You're coaching writing and you're also writing.
Yes.
I try to do something similar. Talk to me more about that
Okay.
ecosystem.
One distinction I want to make is
Okay.
that whatever you choose to do to pay your bills feeds your writing. Everything you do
Love
feeds
it.
your creativity.
Love it.
It's a matter of how you want to see it. So if you're slinging lattes at Starbucks, because I've done that, I've worked food service, I've been a bartender, I've been a barista, I've whatever, like you name it in the hospitality industry, I've done it. So I've been a nanny, like, and all of those things, if you choose to see it in this way, can feed your creativity. And I think that's so important for people to understand, because it can either be that you can be working at Starbucks and, writing your screenplay or whatever on the side, or what I'm doing now also works really nicely, which is you have a business, a whole business that has a business model that, is cash flow positive. And part of that business is a book that you write, which I see the books that I write as, you could call it a lead magnet, or you could call it like a elaborate business card
Mhm.
that introduces me, like Write Your Story introduced me to you. And
100%.
you didn't know who I was before you read Write Your Story. And maybe, I don't even know if you've read the whole book, but you see the book, you're interested in the concept, you read parts of it, and you're like, oh, I
Yeah.
want to know this person.
And I also
And
wanna
so
share what you have to say, like
100%. And so we connect because of that. So even if you never purchase a copy of my book, even if you just see my book on Instagram and get interested in me and come, we're going to have this conversation, and maybe some people hear about the services that I provide and they come and purchase those services. So that's all contributing to the entire ecosystem of the business. Even if the book only sells 5,000 copies or 25,000 copies or whatever it is, it doesn't need to be a New York Times bestselling book in order to be legitimate.
Mhm. So one of the approaches that I use, because I had to go through this same little process and this epiphany of like, how do I build an ecosystem? I still love that word. I'm gonna keep coming back to it. And one of the things that I noticed about your books is that they're this. What was the first one that you said that sold so well? The
Packing light.
Packing Light, right? I
Hmm.
do think that's because that's just like straight value. Like it's very
Yeah.
clear and concrete
Yeah.
is why that probably sold so well.
Yeah.
But I noticed they weren't all like in the same, like in storytelling for me or something like that. So they're a little different. And in my opinion, to build the ecosystem that we're talking about, I kind of use the hub and spoke approach where I clearly identify who I am and what I have to
Hmm.
offer in the unique way that I view the work that I do in the world. And then I can create spokes off of that hub. So I can be a podcaster, I can be a writer. I'm also a storytelling coach. I'm a filmmaker. That's my main bread and butter, et cetera, et cetera. But with that core intact, they're all aligned. They're all part of the same
Sure.
wheel, right? So, do you try to identify some through line? Is there a through line with your books, or is it like this is what I'm going through right now, and I have something to say about it, and I'm putting out that book, and then
Yeah.
the next book is the next book,
There is a through line to what I do, but it's taken me a really, really long time to get there. I've been doing this for 10 years. And
yeah,
I didn't have when I wrote Packing Light, I didn't have a through line.
right,
I knew that I had a story to tell, and I wasn't even sure what the story was. When I quit my job, I just knew that I had a story to tell. I had no idea what the book was going to be called. I didn't know what I was going to write about. I just knew that I had something I wanted to write, and I was determined to get that done. So then, Packing Light came out and sold very well. And so then for a while it was like, okay, because Packing Light was published through Moody Publishers, which is a massive publisher, but it's an evangelical Christian publisher out of
mm,
Chicago. So it was like, am I a Christian memoirist? Is that what I am? Or like for a while, the book was being filed in the dating and relationships section of bookstores. And I was keeping this blog. I was single at the time. I was writing about my kind of dating adventures. So I was like, okay, so am I a dating person? Like, am I like an advice columnist? Is that what I am? And I went through that phase for a while. Um, and then Indestructible came out. Indestructible, was also kind of in that vein. So I was writing a
mhm,
lot about relationships. Um, and then it wasn't until The Power of Writing It Down came out, or that era of my professional career,
mhm,
where I started to get clear on like, oh, this is what I'm actually doing. I'm not just coaching writers on the side. The big flip for me, honestly, was I had been ghostwriting a bunch of books. I've been editing books. I've been working with all these writers to help them get their books published. And I started to see this pattern over and over and over again, where people were having a profound transformative experience with the writing process. Like, it didn't matter what they were writing about, whether they're writing a business book or they're writing a marriage book or they're writing a book about taxes.
mhm.
No matter what they were writing about, they were having this profound personal experience with the writing process. And that was like the ticket for me. Like, it was like, that's what I want to do with my with my life, with my career, with my energy, is to help people, almost be like a guide to people on the journey
Hmm.
of putting their stories down on paper. And so then The Power of Writing It Down came out. That was my third book that came out, and that was the first time where I really started to gain clarity on who I was as an author,
Hmm.
or who I was as a business person. It's like, I'm a person who teaches people how to write their stories. And then Write Your Story was a natural outpouring of that. But, I mean, that was like, so Power of Writing It Down came out 5 years into my professional writing career. And that was the first time when I really started to get clarity. I say that I do think it's so important for people to hear that you don't have to know when you start who you
Yeah.
are as a
Yeah.
writer.
And it evolves. Like who you
Mm-hmm.
are when you start or the next year is not who you're going to be in 5 years.
A
And just like
hundred
any
percent.
artist that you look up to, think about musicians. Like if you don't evolve, it'll pass you by. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I'm currently thinking about that now because I've been in the storytelling space. I mean, I've been a storyteller my whole career and life, but in terms of using it as a platform to teach and educate since 2018. So, that's 6 years. I'm at a point where it's the cycle has kind of ended and it's time to
Yes.
go to that next stage of the evolution. So, yeah, that's you don't have to be the same person, and you shouldn't be, right? Like,
No,
but
yeah.
that is key because the action often informs you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just getting out there and writing. It's the same thing on the micro level of writing the book and the macro level of like what type of author am I? Well, you don't know until you start, swinging,
Yep.
so to speak.
Yep. True
Yeah,
story.
that's such a good point. What does everyone? The general question is, does everyone have a story to tell? But I want to elaborate before you answer that. What I'm getting at is like, does everyone have value in like, is there value in someone going through this process if it's not for a commercial purpose,
A
maybe? Like,
100,000%.
please
Yes.
tell me
In
more.
fact, so Indestructible is my second memoir that I wrote. That book was supposed to be a book about marriage. I was married before. I've been through a divorce. This all happened about 10 years ago now, but I was married to my first husband. I was contracted to write a book about how difficult the first few years of marriage can be. Because, like I said, I was keeping this blog. I was writing about marriage, or like kind of dating and relationships. I met my first husband. We had a very like fast romance, got married very quickly. And I was only married to him for 4 years, but the all 4 years of the marriage were incredibly difficult.
Hmm.
And so I wanted to write about what I was going through. So I started writing this book on the first few years of marriage. Well, as I was writing that book, my marriage fell apart. I'm going through a divorce. So I'm like, okay, scrap that book. I'm not going to be able to publish that one. I'll just write about what I'm going through. It was the only thing I could think to do. And at the time, I didn't think I was ever going to be able to publish that piece of work. I was telling a story that was very sensitive. It involved another person. I was sort of like, I felt like airing his dirty laundry a little bit as I was
Mm,
writing the book.
I see that.
And so I was worried about how other people would receive it. And also, since Packing Light had been published with this Christian publisher and I was seen as a Christian author, I was getting a divorce. I
Yep.
was just trying to find my way. I didn't even know, like, what's my worldview now that this has all happened. And so as I was writing that book, I thought, this is just going to be for my own healing. And
Hmm.
the process of writing that book quite literally saved my life. I don't know how I would have made it out of the mess that I was in without having writing as a tool. And I was eventually able to publish Indestructible, but Indestructible has the lowest sales numbers of all four books that I've published.
And you don't
And
care
yet
about that at all.
I don't care. It's the most important book to me. It's the
Yeah.
one I'm most proud of because I told my story in an honest way, and it got me out of the ditch that I was in. And so, you know, if you told me I had to burn all the other books and could only keep the one, I would keep Indestructible. So I tell people that story to say, if you feel that you have a story to tell, but you A, don't know anything about publishing, B, don't think that you would be viable as a published author, you're just like, I don't have the qualifications, I don't know how I would do that. Or C, don't really desire to publish, don't count yourself out of this book writing process because there's so much that can be gained for you in just the journey of taking your story and getting it out of your body and out of your brain and putting it onto paper. Even if no other soul ever reads it, it's important.
I did a similar thing. The first book that I technically ever wrote and completed was about losing my father at an early-ish age. I was in my early 20s, and it was never intended for anyone else's eyes. I had
Mhm.
taken notes. It's called The Last 40 Days with My Father, which was a very tumultuous month and 10 days. Crazy story. Yeah, it wasn't for anyone else, and I did it, and it was, I don't know, maybe 70,000 words. But that
Yeah.
process was cathartic, and no one to this day, I don't think even my wife or my mother has read it. Like it was just for me, and then I moved on to things, other ideas that I wanted to write. But yeah, I think you can absolutely do that, and something I've tried to commit to this year is Julia Cameron's morning pages.
Yeah. Oh, yes, the artist way. Yep.
Yeah, the artist. Yeah. And there's something that I want you to talk about this because we're kind of on this topic. But what I've noticed is, well, I'll ask it in a form of a question. Why is the process of writing so helpful for the internal struggle that we might be going through? What is it about putting it down on paper? I'll share my experience if we get there, but I'm curious why you think the act of writing does it.
Yeah, I have two theories. Number one is there's a disconnect, an inherent disconnect between the way that we think about things and the embodied, the way that we move through the world.
Mm.
So there's a word for it. It's called cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have cognitive dissonance. You think you're a really kind person, but then you don't. You're not witnessing yourself in certain situations where you make choices that just are not kind. But you think you're a kind person because you know your own intentions and you know that you would never maliciously hurt anybody. And so there's this disconnect between the way you think, what you believe, how you see the world, your worldview, and then your embodied way of being. And I think that writing is an amazing way to close that gap. This is kind of the second reason I think. One of the reasons I think it closes that gap is because it gives us a way to see ourselves more clearly. My therapist told me years ago that her definition of mental health is a radical commitment to truth at all costs. And to me, writing gives us an opportunity to connect in with truth. Like I'll give a writer an assignment to say something like, to make a list, like 10 things that are true for me today. And
Wow.
you'd be shocked when you pick up the pen and put it to paper, what you see yourself say that you do know it somewhere deep down, but you're not connected to it. Like, I'm exhausted,
Yeah.
or I need a break, or I'm unhappy in my marriage, or like stuff that you're just like, somewhere deep down, I do know that, but I'm living my life disconnected from that knowing. And writing brings us back into contact with that knowing. And so, the data shows that writing improves our mental and emotional health in a ton of ways. Like, people who write regularly are more likely to report being happier in their romantic partnerships. People who write regularly are physically healthier. They visit the doctor 50% less often for upper respiratory infections and flu. People who write regularly, like addicts who write during their recovery, are more likely to stay in recovery than addicts who don't.
Wow.
Cancer patients who write through chemo respond better to chemo treatments than those who don't journal their way through the process. So the data shows us that writing is an incredible tool for our mental and emotional health. The data doesn't show us why, but my prediction of why is because it connects us into what is true.
Whew. That's deep. That's profound and so true from my experience. But I didn't know about the data. But that's, man, that's amazing. For me and for folks listening who aren't familiar with the artist way, it's basically just three, longhand pages every morning, unprompted, unstructured, just brain dump. But I always end up having, I just am talking about how I feel, what happened, etc. And by the end of that 3 pages, the theme already, like, it always reveals itself, and why I might be feeling that way tends to, tie a bow on it by the end of it. It's funny because I had made a post about it, a video, and I was like, I mean, I don't have the desire, not the desire, but I haven't felt the need to see my therapist as regularly because of that, because a lot of my issues are kind of showing themselves. Some
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
somebody commented and said, and they were just poking fun. They were polite, but they were like, men will write three handwritten long pages every day instead of going to see a therapist. And I was like, wait, we
Wait.
respect therapy around here.
Yes, yes,
But
yes.
I thought that was funny. But it has been really helpful because, in my perspective, it's the same exact thing you're saying. But I look at it like a movie. That's my background of like, if you can zoom out and
Yeah.
look at your life and you as the character in the story, it allows you to see that objective picture. But when you're in it, like a maze, right? When you're in it and the walls are beside you, you can't see where you're going. If you're at the bird's eye view, you can see, there's a
Yes.
wall there or where you came from, you've already been
Yep.
that direction, etc. And it's such a good point. But I didn't know all of those other things about like it makes a lot of sense. Cancer patients writing about it, people going to the doctor. That is amazing. One thing that I've noticed about you is with all your different coaching products, different books, etc. You seem to have been really it looks like you're very efficient in terms of having representation of all of these projects and products online. So they almost look like they're their own brands, right? You have a website
Sure.
for this book and that book, which is difficult to do versus just like AllisonFallon.com and everything is
Sure.
there, right? So how do you do that efficiently and effectively? How do you do that to make it easier because you have, quite a few out there for your projects? Is there any strategies or tactics
Yeah.
you use for that?
Well, I've tried to keep them separate to some extent for simplicity for the end user. Like, I
Yeah.
think it's easier if you go to the writeyourstory.com and there's the book, there's the
Hmm.
podcast, and there's Write Your Story workshops. Or, I do have AllisonFallon.com is a website. I also own that website, and there are services on that website as well. Um, I don't know. So, in terms of how I do it, I have a team
Yeah.
that runs
Does
it
it
all
get
for me. So
difficult to manage like that, or is it actually easier for you
I
to
think
have?
it's easier
Yeah.
for me to have them compartmentalized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, you're based in Nashville, right? That's when.
Yeah.
How did you link up with the Story Brand team?
I've known Don forever. So we knew each other back when we lived in Portland,
Okay.
and totally separately, like, we were loose acquaintances back then. He moved to Nashville with his now wife, Betsy, and I
Mhm.
moved here with my first husband, and totally separately moved here and then reconnected once we made it to Nashville. And Betsy and I became very fast friends. And
That's
so that's
it's
how
a
we've.
it's a nice little community that you all have there. I'm also friends with Grant Baldwin in the Speaker
Oh,
Lab team,
yes. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'm like, how are all these people? Should I move to Nashville? Uh,
Honestly, it's why I moved to Nashville, because
is it?
there are publishers here, there's
Yeah,
agents here, there's, if you're working in the creative space at all, there's such a wonderful creative community here. And it's a nice blend of, like, because I grew up in Portland, Oregon, which is a very creative place.
yeah,
Um, Nashville is a nice blend of, like, you get the the softness of the Southern hospitality and the friendliness,
hmm,
but also the fastness of, like, a bigger city, because you've got people from other places who are moving here.
yeah,
So it's like a really nice, like, I call it the South light. It's like you get a little Southern touch, but
yeah.
also
The
a
city
city
feel,
vibe,
yeah.
which
No, it's
I'm kind of used to urban living. So
it's a great city too. You and Don met in the in Pal's books,
yeah, yeah, no,
nerding out over there.
that would be a great story of how we met. No, we had mutual friends through church. Honestly, that's how we
That's
met.
cool.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk a little bit about the find your voice aspect.
Okay.
This is something I mentioned it to you before we started the conversation that comes up in almost every conversation I have on the podcast, and I often talk to marketers for Fortune 500 companies, filmmakers, novelists, et cetera, screenwriters, a lot of screenwriters because I'm a filmmaker. Let's start with how important is it to find and cultivate a unique and identifiable voice? You talked about yourself it taking quite some time to find that. But we
Hmm.
also talked about how you don't necessarily need to know that to get started. So how important is it to get to that point where you're like, this is a Rain Bennett film or book?
Yeah. I mean, it's gonna, what I'm gonna say is gonna sound like two things that don't fit together, but They do. It's 100% necessary to get there. Your voice is the thing about you that's so unique that's going to make people crave the things that you're making.
Mhm.
It's like a fingerprint. Nobody can replicate it. Nobody else can be you. Nobody else can share your story. Nobody else can see the world through your eyes, through your lens, through your perspective. You're the only person on planet Earth who will ever be here or ever has been here who sees the world in the exact way that you see it. And so, and I think like there's a famous quote from, I'm blanking on who it's from, but I can almost, Martha Graham, who says something like that. And she says it more eloquently than I'm saying it, but it's just like, it starts out, there's a quickening. Let me see if I can find this because it'd be worth reading. Basically, like a message that's coming through you that's so unique to you that nobody else could ever replicate it. Yeah, here we go. There's a vitality, a life force, a quickening that is translated through you into action. There is only one of you in all of time. This expression is unique, and if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium and it will be lost. The world will not have it. This is not your business to determine how good it is, how it compares with other expressions. It's your business to keep it yours clearly and directly, to keep the channel open. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. You have to keep open and aware directly to the urges that motivate you. Keep the channel open. No artist is pleased. There's no satisfaction whatsoever at any time. There's only a queer, divine dissatisfaction, a blessed unrest that keeps us marching and makes us more alive than the others.
Got chills.
That's it. Like, so on the one hand, finding your voice, finding that quickening, that vitality, that opening, that channel of expression is the only thing in your life that matters. Everything else is worthless. Like paying your bill, I mean, pay your mortgage, sure, so you don't get kicked out of your house, but it's less important than this thing that's trying to come through you. So on the one hand, it's the most important thing you could ever do with your life. On the other hand, I think we get in this mode where we're so intent on finding it, we're so obsessed with finding it, that we can't surrender to the fact that it's already trying to happen through us. So you don't have to get it. You don't have to chase it down.
Yeah, it's not a quest.
It's not a
It's
quest.
within you.
It's an allowing. It's already there. And most of what it takes to let it come out is the stripping away of who you thought you were supposed to be, of the way you're trying to impress other people, of of copying others, of needing to have a bunch of followers on Instagram. Like, give up on that, give up on needing a platform, give up on needing to be important or significant, give up on the New York Times list, give up on all of that. When you can strip all of that away, then the unique expression that can only come through you comes through you. And oddly, ironically, it gives you the platform, the listenership, the audience, it gives you all of that, but not because you chased it, because you let it go.
I mean, we could just stop right there. That's so good. We always seek it out there. Always. Wow. And it is that process of letting go, like letting it speak to you. It's so simple, right? But it's so difficult for people to
Yes.
do. It's simple in theory, but difficult in execution. But it's there. It's been there the whole time. Any tactics? Like if someone was like, "Okay, I'm in. How do I find my voice?"
Okay,
Any?
so the tactics that I give people, I call this getting limbic, because you know how I was saying before, like we've got our thought life and then you've got your embodiment, and the two are like separated in the modern world. So the science behind this is your frontal cortex is your higher level executive functioning part of your brain, and that's the part of you that knows, like, or that can think the thoughts. Like you call yourself kind, you want to be kind. Of course, I'm kind. And then you have your limbic system, which is the embodied part of you that's moving through the world. And that is the part of us that we more often ignore. And it's the part of us we have to access in order to integrate the two. So if you're going to actually become kind, you can't just think, I'm kind. I hope I'm kind. I want to be kind. I'm a kind person. It's good to be kind. You have to actually move through the world as kindness. And in order to do that, ironically, we have to almost embrace the part of us the embodied part of us that's not there yet.
Mhm.
And so I talk about what I tell writers is to the tactics are about getting limbic. It's about getting into your limbic system and becoming more embodied. And surprisingly, the tactics are actually they're very like I can give you specifics. Like one way to get more limbic is to just get your heart rate up.
Yeah.
So a walk around the block.
Absolutely. So much clarity comes from movement.
Totally. Getting your heart rate up what it does is it activates the lower part of your brain that is your embodiment. It activates your limbic system. Um, let's see, another way to activate your limbic system, or not even activate, it's very active while you're sleeping. Your limbic system is where dreams come from. And so it's one of the reasons why a lot of the advice that artists will get and writers will get is to write first thing in the morning, because your limbic system is already active. Before you ever touch a device, before you ever go to a meeting, before you ever talk to another soul in the morning. I mean, I have kids in my house, so that doesn't work as well for me anymore, but especially if you live alone, or if you live with a partner and can just say like, hey, the first hour of the morning is kind of like my sacred time. I'm going to do my writing or whatever at that time. If you can get out of bed and stay limbic and sit down and do your writing, you're going to get more bang for your buck. You're just going to get more juice from the orange at that time of the morning. Then at 3 p.m., when your brain is tired and you've been living in your frontal cortex all day, it's harder to get into the limbic system when you're out of it than it is to just stay in it. In fact, several chapters of Indestructible were written from like 2 to 6 in the morning, because I would wake up in the middle of the night with like a wild impulse to write a
Mhm.
chapter or get a story down. And I would just pull my computer out and get it down real quick. And then, sometimes go back to sleep and sometimes not. And I've talked to a lot of writers who have had similar type experiences where you get like real insights in the middle of the night. I think it's because your limbic system is very active that time of night. So any way you can capitalize on that is a help.
I just want to jump in and plus one something you alluded to. This is for the younger writers out there, or writers sans children. When that happens, you don't have very much control over your time. So if you want to be a writer and you don't have kids yet, start doing
Yeah.
this now, because when that productive time you're talking about is also mine. And with the first kid, it was quite easy, and then the second one came along, and it
Oh
was just
yeah.
like, "Oh, what? You like to
Yeah.
get up at 5 o'clock and write? No more, buddy." So
I know.
it
I
just
was
it
talking
shifts
to
things.
I was talking to a friend of mine about this recently too, and this might be a detour. You can tell me, you don't want to go this way, but who's a songwriter, and he and I were saying the hardest part about doing creative work with children is your white space is gone. And white space is where all the ideas come through.
Yeah.
So I'm still trying to figure this out. Like I could carve out an hour first thing in the morning. Like if I woke up before my kids, I could for sure
Yeah.
write for an hour. But my white space is gone. So I don't have the ability to, like, the ideas would percolate in the white space before I had kids, and then I would carve out an hour to get the writing done. And now if I'm carving out an hour, I need to find room for the white space. So
Yeah.
I just haven't figured out that solution
It's
yet.
tough,
How do
and you
you?
really gotta give yourself some grace, because even if you do wake up an hour early, I tried it, it's not consistent, because then one on Wednesday, he wakes up a little early, he cries,
Yep.
and you gotta
Yeah.
break up that time and go, it's just very tough, and you have to be very graceful to yourself and also very realistic about what can be accomplished.
Yeah.
My first book, which was 2021, I was on the deadline after I had the second kid. It was awful for my whole family. My wife, I mean, myself, trying to get that out in the terrible. Like
Yeah.
in hindsight, I'm like, what were you even thinking?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but we did it. We
We just do
survived.
the
But
best we can.
yeah, just do the just do the best we can. Exactly. That whole section about the limbic system is just so good. Um, yeah, I love that, but it does change with children. I just wanted to make that note for
Yeah.
folks, because I lost that, and I didn't know what to do at first. I didn't know, like, because it was my most productive time of day, and it was eradicated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I want to shift a little bit more to the write your story aspect of it. We've still got a little bit of time. You still good on time?
Yeah.
Um, this is a concept that I've seen debated a lot lately, and I know that you talk about outlining a lot and the importance of
Hmm.
outlining, and for that first step for writing. And this happens with film as well, especially screenwriting, but also filmmaking specifically. The concept of like just take action, right? Just write. Just go make your
Mhm.
movie. And we can just stick with writing for this example. And the other side seems to be like, yeah, but if you do it without thinking, then you're writing for like no reason. And it's a constant debate of like, is it better to just take action and then it will come, or do you think it to death and now risk never taking action, right?
Sure.
Right. So it's
Yeah.
like, it's kind of and it kind of comes from like the teacher perspective or the doer, player perspective. So talk to me about those two concepts of like just write and
Yeah.
but be prepared to have an outline, etc., and know where you're going, or at least where you want to go.
It's another one of those things in the world of creativity where they sound like they're opposites, but they actually play very nicely together if you can allow them to. So, what I share in Write Your Story is how naive I was in the beginning, that I had this vision in my head of what I thought it would look like to be a writer. And the idealist in me really needed it to be this thing where I would sit down at the computer and I'd be struck with inspiration. And the thing that would come through me would be so powerful that everyone in the world would want to read it and it would just effortlessly flow through. And because of that, I was unwilling to start with an outline. I was unwilling
Mm.
to think through, what am I actually writing about? What's the controlling idea of this book? Like, what's the topic even that I'm writing about? I was just unwilling to go there because of my naivete as an artist and this need for it to be this organic kind of thing. And what I learned through the process is if I had been willing to ask myself, like, what am I trying to say? Like, imagine yourself on a stage in front of thousands of people, because that's what I was wanting to publish this book and have thousands of people read it. So I ask writers this all the time. I'm like, imagine yourself on a stage in front of thousands of people and someone hands you a microphone. What do you want to say? You know what I'm saying? So, and if you go up on the stage with no clue what you want to say and expect whatever comes out of your mouth to be profound.
Oof. The thing is, like, okay, if you're a veteran at this, if you're experienced, you might be able to wing it, right?
Yes,
It might not,
1000%.
right? Like, I feel like I could go up there, but you'd still have to know a direction, and it would not be as good.
And the people who wing it, the people who say they're winging it, are people who have already written or outlined this content.
Yeah,
They're
yeah, yeah,
teaching it in some other capacity. And
yeah.
so it's like, that's why you think you're winging it, but you're actually not winging it because you've had a decade of practice.
Precisely, right, right. But it still would be very rough around the edges because you didn't think about how does, part two lead into part three
Yes.
perfectly, right? You could talk about it if you're passionate about it or if you know the topic. Like
Yes.
I could talk for hours, right? But it doesn't mean there's going to be a structure that actually lands well and is, positioned. There was a guy I had on the show, Ken Adams. He's a long form improv.
Oh yeah, I know
You know
Ken.
him? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes,
So the
yes.
story spine was do you know that
Yeah.
formula he came up with? Pixar uses it, et cetera.
Yep.
Well, that was because they're doing 60-minute plays, improv. And if you
Yeah.
didn't know this structure, that's why he taught this
Yes.
8-step structure of story, larger
Yep.
stories. Then, if you veer off into this, funky, scene that someone throws out there in
Yeah.
improvs, you have to have that skeleton and structure to be able to come back to.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're out here on a limb and you can't ever bring it back. That's why he created that. And that's exactly what we're talking about. It's an outline.
Yes.
Once upon a time there was this, and every day this, until one day this, and I thought that was so simple and so profound because yeah, you can't do a 60-minute improv play without a spine to it.
100%. I just finished doing a year of improv classes every Monday night for 3 hours. I did improv classes for a
What?
year
That is so
and did
cool.
6 levels of improv. And one of the most shocking things to me about the improv experience was exactly what you're talking about. That you think when people get up on a stage, I mean, they are improving everything. Nothing is planned in terms of the content, but the structure is very planned. The structure is set in place ahead of time. And without that structure, just like you're talking about, you wouldn't even know how to you wouldn't know, nobody would know where to go. Nobody would be able to follow their scene partner. And so yeah, and that's what an outline does for a writer. It's exactly what an outline does for a writer. Is it just tells me, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I want to tell the reader. This is the message that I'm trying to get to. And I might change the direction that I go for how I get there, but that's the destination that I'm trying to arrive at. So I'm a huge advocate for starting with an outline. I think it could have saved me years of time
Hmm.
writing my first book. It has saved me years of time on other books I've written, and I've saved lots of other authors years of time as well.
And on the flip side of that, how do you mitigate the risk of getting stuck in structure land where you try to build it like mathematically and of course
Sorry.
that's all right.
Can you just take her out maybe, or okay, thank you. Um, Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all right. I think there's a risk sometime. I see this in story structure a lot, like filmmaking. So not necessarily nonfiction, maybe. I mean, I think it could apply there too. Where people try to stick too closely to a template or a
Yeah,
formula and write it that way versus maybe just getting it out, starting with your outline, getting it out, and then maybe restructuring it later where it's like, well, where's my inciting incident? It's supposed to happen at this
yeah,
stage, etc.
yeah. The example that I use is bumper bowling. You always want to start with bumper bowling. Bumper bowling teaches you how to bowl because it just shows you when you don't have any idea where the ball is going to go when you throw it down the lane. It's really nice to have the bumpers there, or you're just going to spend the whole time with your ball in the gutter. But eventually the goal is to get the bumpers off. Eventually the goal is that there's like almost metaphysical bumpers. Like your muscle memory tells you you don't toss the ball there. um there's a book that came out in 2022 called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. Have you read that book?
Mm-mm.
I'm blanking on the author's name right this minute, but she's fabulous. The book was the best book I had read in a couple of years. I was just enamored with this book, and I was trying to figure out, like, where did this person come from, because it's not common to have a book come out and it's the author's first book and it's such a breakout book. It's like, New York Times bestseller, millions of readers, everybody's loving it, and it's so well written, so well done. So I started doing research on this woman to try to Gottlieb, is that her name?
Yep.
Did you just look it up? Okay.
Yep.
So I started doing research on this woman to find out where she came from, and sure enough, she came out of movies and TV. She was a writer on Friends. She was a writer on, I think, the show ER. So
Wow.
I'm like, no wonder her first book was as good as it was, because she understands how stories work.
Hmm.
When people tell me they write without an outline, 99.99% of the time, the reason that they can write a great book without an outline is because the outline is built into their DNA. They know so well how stories work.
Yep.
They've practiced it so intimately that it
Hmm.
just comes out of them that way. And that's the goal, is for us to get to the place where we
Yeah.
know it so intimately we don't need to sit there and look at, like, okay, so when does the inciting incident happen? You just That's just how you tell a story. Most of us aren't quite there yet, and so we need the structure to help us along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I had another guest on a while back, Robbie Crabtree, that helps like founders when they're trying to raise money, when they're pitching investors, and he talks a lot about how the best storytellers seem like it's going off the cuff, but that's because
Yeah,
they've practiced it so much that then they can make it feel like they're just talking and they don't,
yeah,
they're not reciting it, but it actually is scripted. And at first,
yes.
when it's scripted, it suffers, right? Because it sounds like you're reading it,
Hmm.
and then you do it so much that the high points, the slow points. You know how to pace it, and the best speakers he was talking about specifically are so prepared that it seems like they just got up there and talked about a topic.
Totally.
Yeah.
And the two things that seem contradictory but aren't are
Hmm.
structure and dance. So you've got the structure that sort of guides your process, and then you have to learn how to dance and flow. So it's like masculine, feminine, and they come together and they fit nicely together. They just, they complement one another. And I think, that's what we're all facing as creative people, is how can I learn the structure, learn the limits, the boundaries, and then also learn creative ways to break the boundaries and to flow with it and to make something totally unique that's never been made before. But you can't do one without the other.
I love this so much. I love doing this show so much because it always lands on these similar themes, and they're like life lessons, right? The
Yeah.
structure and the dance. And I don't want to digress too much, but I literally had this conversation this morning. I was playing soccer with some friends, and I made a movie a while back about a weird fitness subculture it was calisthenics, but the way they were doing it was like an art form, and it had style to it. And then they started having competitions, and it went all over the world. And I made a film about it. But what I literally said to the guy who I was explaining it to, I was like, you have to, like anything, you have to master the basics first. And once they got basic, lots of pull-ups and lots of push-ups, then they would do it where they kind of started like moving side to side, and they'd make
Mm,
creative choices with it. Or some people would be naturally more explosive and dynamic, and some would be rhythmic
yeah.
and smooth. And it's literally what you just talked about. Is like you have to have that baseline
Yep.
of the basics. And any expert, any high level performer will always tell you it's because I mastered the basics, and they always come back
Hmm.
to the basics. And those middle level folks try to skip past it, but the masters always have that structure down so well, and then you're able to bend the rules
Yes. Yep.
and get creative with it. I just see this theme, this concept, this we've been talking about it all day, this kind of duality or seemingly polarity that works so well together. But that is life, right? It is
It is
masculine, it is
life.
feminine, it is yin
Yep.
and yang. So I love that. I know we're running out of time, so I want to focus lastly on, you work with, probably, I'm assuming, with a lot of first time writers. Is that
Hmm.
fair? Okay. So let's start there. Someone, okay, Allie, I've got an idea. I want to do it. We've talked about the outline, but what are the other first bits of advice in terms of like, okay, you're ready to pull the trigger, you're ready to do this. Where do we go? What is step one?
Yeah, the first thing that I'm going to help someone do is define the controlling idea of their book, assuming that they're working on a book. Or, honestly, whatever you're working on, even if it's just an Instagram post, um, you need to know, what am I trying to say?
Hmm.
What's the one idea that controls the entire shape of this book? And that's a big task, but it's a really important task. And you define the controlling idea, and then you get started writing, and that informs the controlling idea. The controlling idea is a working document, and it evolves along the way. But you need to start with something. And this is where I really went wrong with my first book. Is, I said I thought I could write it in 6 months. It took me 3.5 years. The big reason for that time difference is because I had no idea what I was trying to say. And I was on my own journey, and I needed to figure it out. And I tell people, I'm like, if you're fine taking 10 years to write a book because you're not trying to publish this and you're enjoying yourself, then by all means, like, be on your journey and figure it out. But if you're like, I'm frustrated, I'm stuck, I have no idea where to start, then let's talk. Let's talk. Let's figure out the controlling idea of the book. Let's give you a starting place. Let's give you bumpers so that you can learn how to bowl. So that in 3 years from now, not only will you have a book finished, but
Mhm.
also you'll know how to bowl or know how to
Nice
write a book.
callback.
Yeah.
Nice callback, Allie. And flip that. How do we get across the finish line?
Okay. Well, do we have another hour? There's a lot to say.
Yes, there's the whole messy middle in between that.
Yeah.
But in general terms,
You just you just do it. I mean, so I know that sounds like that. Okay, I have a program where I teach people how to write a book in 6 months. It's called A Book in
Okay.
6 Months. And we work on it together because people have this assumption that it's supposed to take forever. It's got to take 5 years, and it's going to be hours and hours of my time. Like when I was teaching, I thought, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to work on this 40 hours a week. You do not need to work on a book 40 hours a week to get done. And I tell people, in 6 months, if you can carve out 3 to 5 hours a week, in
Yeah,
6 months, you can have a finished manuscript. And it's really about consistency. So it's about knowing what you're writing about starting with an outline, about creating a plan for what you're going to do on a weekly basis. Like, what's your writing schedule going to look like? It doesn't have to be elaborate, but it needs to be consistent. So it needs to be like, every Saturday morning, my spouse takes the kids, I go to the coffee shop, and for 3 full hours, I just write. And because I have an outline, I know that this Saturday I'm working on chapter 3, and next Saturday I'm working on chapter 4, or whatever. So you have, a consistent routine that you follow. You get your butt in the seat, and you just get the thing done. And really, another thing I will borrow from Anne Lamott is the shitty first draft.
totally.
People are so worried about their work is so connected to their identity. They're so worried about having a shitty first draft that they avoid doing it at all.
Hmm.
Every first draft is shitty. Every single first draft. Every first draft of every book I've ever written. Every first draft I've ever read from another author is shitty. You have to get something on the page to have something to start
Absolutely.
with.
Absolutely.
And
And you're
so,
gonna rewrite it anyway. Like,
Yes.
you have to. So don't spend your time editing on that first draft, because the risk there, and it's a classic one that stops a lot of people, is that you don't get to the finish line,
Yes. Yes.
right? I absolutely.
Most people are just overthinking it. I mean, you just need to get your butt in the seat, get the thing written, get a first draft done, and then you can edit from there. And
Yeah.
so
I did
that's
the
why,
Seinfeld strategy this year. I'm trying to get screenplays done that I've had in my head for like 10 years, and it's just the red X on the day on the calendar. And it's like, if I have
yeah,
5 days in a row, it's really tough for me to want to not show up on day 6.
yeah,
Just having that, it's worked wonders for me.
totally. And everybody's schedule's a little different. So I tell people, some people, 10 minutes a day, 7 days a week. And that's good. Or 20 minutes a day, 7 days a week,
And
whatever.
people think it's
For other
not.
people,
Like,
like for my schedule, it would work better to do every Friday and Saturday in the morning for 2 hours or whatever. Like, it just depends on what your life looks like. But I do instruct people to create a writing routine that is really doable within the confines of your actual life. Like, you have the idealistic version of what it could look like for you to be a writer, and then there's the real version. And you have to plan for the real, because otherwise you get in this shame spiral where it's like, you say you're going to write a book, and then you're just like, I'm going to write for 3 hours every morning, first thing when I wake up. Then you don't do it, inevitably, because
mhm.
that's a lot. And then
And then what happens?
you shame yourself, and
Yep.
you go, oh, I always do this. I
Yep.
could never be a
I'm no
writer.
good. I'll never make it. It'll never happen.
And it's like, just give it 5 minutes a day. And then you write for 5 minutes every day, and you're like, oh, I have an idea. I'm going to write for 10 minutes or 15. And then you start to feel like, oh, actually, look, I did more than I was planning to do. Look at me. I'm so
Absolutely.
accomplished. I'm
You know
making
what?
so much
You know what I
progress.
think would help, Allie?
What?
Getting limbic.
Yes. Yeah. Do a couple jumping jacks next to your
Absolutely.
yeah.
This has been amazing. You are amazing. I'm so glad that we had this conversation. I reached out to you. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm so
What a
grateful.
great conversation. I appreciate you so much.
Thanks for having me.